In February 1995, one of the oldest and most prestigious banks in the world ceased to exist. Not because of a recession, not because of a market crash, not because of any force of nature or act of God, because of one man, a 28-year-old from Watford, England, working out of a small office in Singapore, who had been hiding his losses in a secret account for 3 years. His name was Nick Leeson, and by the time anyone found out what he had done, it was already too late. To understand how one person could bring down a 233-year-old institution, you first need to understand what Barings Bank actually was. Founded in 1762, Barings was not just a bank, it was a British institution. It had financed the Napoleonic Wars. It had helped fund the Louisiana Purchase, the transaction that effectively doubled the size of the United States. Its clients included Queen Elizabeth II herself. When people said Barings was too big to fail, they were not speaking in financial terms. They were speaking in historical ones. Nick Leeson grew up in a working-class family in Watford. He left school at 18 with 1 A-level and talked his way into a junior back-office role at Coutts Bank. He was not brilliant in the conventional sense. He was not from the right schools or the right family, but he was charming, he was relentless, and he had an almost physical need to prove himself. By his mid-20s, he had worked his way up through Morgan Stanley and then Barings, and in 1992, Barings sent him to Singapore to run their futures trading operation on the Singapore International Monetary Exchange. He was 25 years old. He had more authority than almost anyone his age in the industry, and he was completely, dangerously out of his depth. Leeson's job in Singapore was officially to manage the back office, the administrative side of Barings futures trading. But he also obtained a license to trade, which meant he was simultaneously the person placing the trades and the person responsible for recording and checking them. This was a catastrophic conflict of interest. In any well-run institution, it would never have been allowed. But Barings was expanding fast. Good people were scarce, and nobody in London was paying close enough attention to what was happening in Singapore. Leeson had, entirely by accident, been handed the keys to a room with no cameras. The trouble began almost immediately. In July 1992, one of Leeson's junior traders made a mistake, a simple error that resulted in a loss of about £20,000. Leeson knew that reporting it would mean paperwork, scrutiny, possibly discipline. So instead he did something that would define the next 3 years of his life. He opened a secret account number 88888, and hid the loss inside it. He told himself it was temporary, that he would trade his way out of it, that nobody would ever need to know. He was wrong about all three. For a while it almost worked. Leeson began making increasingly aggressive trades trying to recover the hidden loss. And in the early days, the market cooperated. He was making money, real money, for Barings in his official trading accounts while quietly hemorrhaging it in account. London loved him. His bosses thought he was a genius. In 1993 alone, he generated £10 million in profit for Barings, representing nearly a fifth of the entire firm's annual earnings. He was celebrated. He was promoted. He was given more capital to trade with. Nobody asked the question they should have asked. Why is one trader in Singapore responsible for nearly 20% of our entire profit?
But the losses in account 88888 were growing faster than his profits could cover. By the end of 1994, the hidden account contained losses of approximately £208 million. The entire net worth of Barings Bank was around £470 million. Leeson had already lost nearly half of it, and nobody knew. He was no longer trying to cover a £20,000 mistake. He was trying to cover a hole that had grown large enough to swallow the institution whole. And still, he did not stop. Still, he did not tell anyone. He convinced himself, because he had to, that one more trade would fix it. Then came the Kobe earthquake. On January 17, 1995, a magnitude 6.9 earthquake struck Kobe, Japan, killing more than 6,000 people. For the global financial markets, the earthquake triggered significant volatility in the Nikkei, the Japanese stock market index that Leeson had bet heavily on. Leeson had been wagering that the Nikkei would remain stable. The earthquake sent it into freefall. In the days that followed, instead of cutting his losses, Leeson doubled down. He placed increasingly enormous bets that the Nikkei would recover. It did not recover. Every day the market fell further. Every day the losses in account 88888 grew larger. In 2 weeks, Leeson lost more money than Barings had made in its entire 233-year history. On February 23, 1995, Nick Leeson did not go to work. Instead, he left a note on his desk that said simply, "I'm sorry." He and his wife flew to Kuala Lumpur, then to Brunei, then to Frankfurt. They were running. Back in Singapore, when his colleagues finally opened account 88888, they found losses of £827 million, more than twice the bank's available capital. Barings was insolvent. On February 26, 1995, Barings Bank, founded in 1762, banker to the Queen, financier of nations, was sold to the Dutch bank Empire.AndRuin for £1. Leeson was arrested in Frankfurt and extradited to Singapore. He was convicted of fraud and sentenced to 6.5 years in prison. He served 4 before being released early due to colon cancer. He survived. Barings did not. ING dismantled most of the bank within years of the acquisition. The name Barings, 233 years old, disappeared from the financial world entirely. The staff who had celebrated Leeson's profits, who had championed his talent, who had never asked the questions they should have asked, most of them lost their jobs. None of them had known. That was the part that made it so difficult to understand. Almost everyone at Barings was a victim. There was really only one person responsible. The investigators who went through Barings' records afterwards were struck by one thing above all others. The warning signs had been there for years. Internal auditors had noted irregularities. External auditors had flagged concerns. Colleagues had noticed that Leeson seemed to control too much. A report in 1994 explicitly identified the conflict of interest between his trading and back-office roles. And every single time, the warnings were noted, filed, and ignored. Because Leeson was making too much money for anyone to want to look too closely at how. This is what makes the Barings story different from a simple tale of one rogue trader. Nick Leeson was reckless. Nick Leeson was dishonest. Nick Leeson made choices that destroyed a bank and devastated hundreds of people's lives. All of that is true. But the system that allowed him to do it, that handed him unchecked authority, that celebrated his profits without questioning their source, that filed the warnings and ignored them, that system made it possible. One person lit the match. But the institution had been soaked in petrol for years. Every generation produces its Nick Leesons. Not because every generation produces fraudsters, but because every generation produces institutions that are too dazzled by results to ask how those results were achieved. The lesson of Barings is not about one rogue trader in Singapore. It is about what happens when the incentive to look away becomes stronger than the obligation to look. When profit becomes the only question being asked, the wrong answers can hide in plain sight for years, sometimes for decades, sometimes until there is nothing left. Nick Leeson was released from prison in 1999. He wrote a book about what he had done. He became a public speaker, talking about risk management to the very kind of institutions he had helped destroy. He became chief executive of Galway United Football Club. He rebuilt a life. Whether you find that inspiring or infuriating probably says something about how you think about accountability and redemption. Both reactions are reasonable. What is not reasonable, what the Barings story makes impossible to argue, is that one person operating alone, without oversight, without checks, without anyone asking the right questions, can bring down something that took 2 centuries to build, in less than 3 years. Next time on Empire.AndRuin, the story of a woman who built a blood testing company worth $9 billion on technology that did not exist, who convinced some of the most powerful people in the world to invest in something that could never do what she claimed, and who kept the lie going for longer than anyone thought possible. Subscribe so you don't miss it.